The corporate media never misses a chance to blame right wingers.
A growing movement led by right-wing politicians is increasingly challenging a centuries-old value of America's political system, the separation of church and state.
This trinity here where they have the far right, they have some form of religion that's connected to the church, and it's all connected to the state.
And much like last time, the former president has help from right-wing media.
Right-wing media seized on a moment at the G7 summit yesterday involving President Biden.
And meanwhile, over in the right-wing media space, they never miss a chance to rail against leftists, be they Democrats, socialists, communists, or Marxist Antifa members.
But the radical left shows there's no bottom to how craven they could be.
The radical left will destroy America if we don't stop them.
A radical left-wing political movement was able to conquer public and private institutions.
When I return to the White House, I will fire the radical left accreditors that have allowed our colleges to become dominated by Marxist maniacs and lunatics.
These days, even if you're politically independent, it's nearly impossible to have a meaningful conversation about politics because we're all trapped inside of this rigidly dichotomous left-right cultural worldview. While more and more Americans are considering themselves politically independent or politically homeless, myself among them, we have to do more to move beyond the polarization of the left-right culture war lens and completely reframe the conversation. My name is Stephanie Edmonds, and I'm here to give you the social studies lesson you should have gotten in high school. Maybe you weren't paying attention, or maybe the purpose of our schools is not to teach you this type of thing. I'll let you decide. Either way, today we're going to discover the historical roots of the terms left and right in politics, which is going to bring us back to the French Revolution. And then we're going to map those on to the modern American left and right, or in my opinion, how they ineffectively map on to our modern American political scene, and how in fact they set us up for far more division than they ever might have to offer in terms of a coherent view of our political landscape. But I'm not just here to critique and complain, I have a solution. So you're going to want to stick around to the end because I have a resource for you to help you get off this left-right ever-sliding scale and have better conversations based on an understanding of policies and their relationship to government power and liberty. And so with that, let's head back to 1789 to the start of the French Revolution. For the purposes of this video, we're not going to go over the entire historical context, but we do need to establish some background so you can understand how the multiple factions that existed before the French Revolution became split into the left and right. So in France, in May of 1789, the Estates General was convened for the first time since 1614. This was a meeting of representatives of France's three social groups: the clergy, or the First Estate, the nobles, or the Second Estate, and the commoners, or the Third Estate. France's king, Louis XVI, had called for the meeting to figure out how to raise taxes and navigate the debt crisis the country was facing, in large part due to the many wars France was involved in over the past century. Complicating matters, however, was the dynamic between the estates. The First and Second Estates didn't pay taxes, but got special privileges and had influence over the king. Meanwhile, the Third Estate, which was comprised of 95% or more of the population, everyone from peasants to shopkeepers to doctors and lawyers, they carried the tax burden and were at the whims of an arbitrary system based on tradition and personal favor. Traditionally, at the Estates General, each estate would deliberate among themselves, and then they would get one vote. And typically what would happen is the First and Second Estates would vote together against the Third Estate, making the Estates General nothing more than a tool of the clergy and noblemen to assert their prerogatives. But this wasn't 1614. It was 1789, and the dynamics had completely changed. The ideas of constitutional monarchy and representative government were in the air. The Third Estate was determined to get more representation. Indeed, they made up more than 95% of the population. Why shouldn't they get more representation? And they wanted to do away with the old system of voting by estate and have each representative get a vote. Prior to the election of representatives to be sent to the Estates General, the Third Estate was able to gain enough popular support, meaning enough people making noise in the streets, to get a doubling of their representatives. However, the issue of voting remained unsettled when the representatives arrived to the Palace of Versailles in May of 1789. And right away, the problem came up. The first order of business was the verification process. The First and Second Estates wanted it to be done separately. But many among the Third Estate did not want to set the precedent of dividing up the estates, and instead called for the process to be done in common with all three estates present. And for the next month and a half, they made little progress bridging the divide. The Third Estate was growing increasingly frustrated, and by June 20th, they had united enough of their representatives to break off from the Estates General and declare themselves the National Assembly and committed to constitutional reform. A few days later, they were joined by the more liberal factions from the First and Second Estates, and soon after that, King Louis was forced to recognize the legitimacy of the National Assembly. And just like that, the entire frame of the conversation shifted. From the limited task of raising taxes within the confines of the estate system, now to the much broader task of restructuring the state of France. Now that each representative had a vote, the diversity of opinion among each of the estates became more obvious. As explained in the book Becoming Revolutionary by Timothy Tackett, Third Estate deputies remain widely at variance and at times confused as to the purpose and goals of the coming assembly. Those who took the time to elucidate their cause in letters and diary entries during the earliest days of the meeting generally persisted in their relatively moderate objectives. Their most aggressive demands arose from a burning desire for legal and fiscal equality, the end of all tax privileges, a single written constitution for all citizens, positions open to talent, a vote by head in the Estates General. Many harbored deep-seated resentment and animosity toward the aristocrats, their privileges, and their condescending attitude. Most, however, were cautious and practical men whose successful careers had been achieved by working within the system. This is a very important point to understand the dynamics of this meeting, because while the Third Estate represented all commoners, the typical representative of the Third Estate was somebody higher up on the socioeconomic ladder. With this in mind, the members of the National Assembly began to sit according to their preference for the balance of power in the new system. Those representatives more critical to the monarchy sat to the left, and those who were less critical sat to the right. In Wrong Turnings, How the Left Got Lost by Jeffrey Hodgson, he explains it like this. From 1789 to 1792, the Assembly divided over the issues of whether the king should have a veto over legislation, over whether there should be a second chamber, and over the nature and extent of the franchise for the election of deputies. Those on the right wished to maintain the authority of the crown by means of a royal veto, to preserve some rights of the aristocracy, to have an unelected upper house, and to maintain major property and tax qualifications for voting. By contrast, the left demanded an end to aristocratic privileges, limitations to the power and privileges of the church, a single-chamber legislature in which all the power rested with democratically elected representatives, and a broad, popular, but wholly male franchise. Newspapers reporting on the event came to refer to the two factions as left and right, and from there the terminology entered into the broader political dialogue. You might have also heard it reported that you should hit that like button so YouTube will show this video to more people. Seriously, it really does help, so if you find value in this content, hit that like button and share it with your friends. I'm trying to increase your knowledge of historical events so we can have more constructive conversations in the present. Which brings us back to the topic of our video. Now that we've discovered the roots of where the left-right terminology comes from, we're going to apply them to the modern American political left-right divide. Do the left and right of the French Revolution have any enduring meaning in our modern politics? Or were the terms just lifted and completely redefined into two new factions? Whatever the answer to that question is, the next question is, does the left-right terminology serve us today? Or is it the relic of a past political reality that is actually causing division and holding us back from finding solutions? So let's go ahead and compare the policies from the left and right during the French Revolution to the policies on the left and right today. and see if we can come up with any common themes. So during the French Revolution, the left wanted to overthrow the social status system, while the right wanted to preserve at least some of it. The left believes power comes from the will of the people, not from tradition or religion, while the right respects traditional authority and institutions, including religion. On the left, they wanted a single legislative body by broad popular franchise. On the right, they were promoting more of a bicameral legislature with an upper chamber based on status and birthright. They also wanted to give the king veto power. And then finally, on the left, they wanted a small state constrained by a constitution which enshrined individual rights, including private property and free markets, whereas the right, they liked the state-run monopolies. Presumably, that's where a lot of their business interests were tied up. Now let's go to the modern left and right and see how they compare. Starting on the left, they believe that equality isn't enough anymore. We need equity, which is equal outcomes. Versus the right, they believe in limited government to protect rights enshrined in the Constitution. And so right there, you can see the modern American right is much more like the left of the French Revolution, and the modern left has taken this idea of equality and taken it further, expanded its meaning quite a bit. On the left, they place reason over religion and tradition, whereas the right places more value and moral authority on traditional institutions, including religion. Now, on this point, they match up almost perfectly with the left and right of the French Revolution. So let's note that and move on to the next point, which on the left, they want the government to intervene in the economy to make it more fair for the common people. And they also want government-funded social services like welfare. Whereas on the right, they want to deregulate government control, allow for free markets, and the protection of private property. Now, this is interesting because the policy of the modern right is very similar to the left of the French Revolution. And the modern left's policy, while they would argue that they want the government to intervene for the good of the common man, they use the mechanism of the big, powerful government in the same way that the right wanted to use it in the French Revolution. We don't have time to get into corporate capture right now, but make a mental note of that and we'll definitely come back. Next up on the left, we have create more acceptance of and opportunities for racial and sexual minority groups. So they want the government to intervene to make more opportunities for more people. Whereas on the right, they're more concerned about using government power to do things like criminalize recreational drug use and abortion. So they want to minimize your social freedoms. And sometimes this is how the modern left and right are summarized, is the modern left wants you to have more social freedoms, whereas the modern right wants you to have more economic freedoms. So as you can see, the left and the right of the French Revolution don't really match up with the left and the right of modern American politics. There's certainly a few similarities, and there's some interesting differences. Perhaps the place where we can find the most similarity is in this notion of conserving and progress. The left of the French Revolution wanted to completely change the system, whereas the right wanted to conserve the old system as much as possible. Now we're living in that new system, and the right's role is to preserve those traditions, whereas the left wants to continue to progress and take those concepts even further. In this way, Matt Iglesias mounts a defense of the left-right political division. On his Substack, Slow Boring, he writes, "The left impulse is towards a leveling of hierarchies. In the specific circumstances of 1789, that meant reducing feudal privileges and building a more capitalist economy. But almost immediately, some on the left began calling for the leveling of general economic disparities, arguing that the original leveling was not driven by a fussy technocratic objection of the operation of feudalism, but by a generalized principle of equality. Over the course of the 19th century, the right reconstituted itself to include defense of the interest of the new capitalist economic elites, as well as old landed elites, and to the extent they exist, feudal prerogatives." And that analysis definitely has merit. But I would argue by accepting this left-right paradigm, we get caught up in this never-ending feedback loop. That which is new becomes old, which becomes tradition, which gets upended for something new, which becomes old, which becomes tradition. It's an ever-moving target. And while some things have longer lifespans like religion, other things have shorter lifespans and move back and forth from the left to the right, like the anti-war movement. Another limiting factor is that neither tradition nor change are fundamentally good or bad in and of themselves. And so, in these ways, the left right dynamic is not a stable set of principles on which to form a coherent political identity. Instead, this is a formula for either side to be an ever changing hodgepodge of ideas where perhaps the only stable characteristic is that they are both willing to use the power of the government to enforce their preferred set of policies on you. Perhaps the most obvious limiting factor of accepting the left right paradigm is that with it, we accept the Democratic Party is on the left and the Republican Party is on the right. And we lack the language to talk about it in almost any other way. When you think about politics in terms of left and right, you can literally be going around in circles for hours. Kim Iverson made a similar point on her show recently.
One thing you're kind of asserting, and I want to get into this in your documentary series, is that this on one hand, there's this left-wing push for organic, but that is being used by these global elites, right, to basically control the food supply. But then the right wing would say, so then you would think automatically the right would say, well, then we reject all of that. But the right isn't. They're not saying, yeah, we want to industrialize farming, because then they look and they see, yeah, but Bill Gates owns all the farms. And so we don't want this industrialized farming. We also want this kind of local, small, organic or whatever, because we don't want the man controlling. So it's like interesting how both groups are pushing for these organic, deindustrialized. Well, I don't know if the left is pushing for deindustrialized. They're certainly pushing for like different, like organic, right, and climate-friendly policies. But it's interesting how both of them are kind of saying the same thing, but for different reasons fundamentally. Although I feel like maybe from the left, they used to say it for the same reasons, that they just wanted to kind of get away from the man. They wanted to be on their own. They didn't want to eat the pesticides. They didn't want to eat the junk that was being pumped into the food supply. And now you've got the right saying that exact same thing.
We are stuck in this trap. And to get out, we have to reframe the conversation and think not about left and right, but about proximity to power. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at an extreme example, because out on the extremes, the trap becomes obvious. On the left-right spectrum, communism will be placed all the way on the left and fascism all the way to the right. This is because communism veils itself in the language of overthrowing the capitalist system and creating one of complete equality, while fascism harkens back to tradition and nationalist identity. But watch this. When we reframe the conversation to be about a policy's relationship to government power and liberty, rather than the language one veils their power in, fascism and communism are in exactly the same place. They proclaim almost total power to shape almost every aspect of people's lives. This is what I like to call the liberty scale. Technically, it's called a Nolan chart, but I'm going to call it a liberty scale. It has two axes. On the left, personal liberty, and on the right, economic liberty. By thinking about the political landscape using a liberty scale, it gives you a consistent baseline from which to judge policies and to think more dynamically about how any given policy relates to the authorization of force you are giving to the government to implement that policy, as well as the interplay of the policy socially and economically. Let's start with the example of compulsory schooling. It'd be right about here on the liberty scale. Lower in economic liberty because the government uses your tax dollars to fund it, and lower in social liberty because it's in the name. It's compulsory. You don't have a choice. You have to go. And you are assigned what school to go to, what classroom, what teacher. Now, you may have a little bit of influence by going to school board meetings or voting for school board members or other ways to participate in the process, but you're always several layers removed from the actual schooling itself. Now let's look at a policy like school choice. That's going to put us right about here. It comes with some more social liberty because you have more choices, but of course, you're still limited by the system. And it's about the same on the economic side of things because the government is using your tax dollars to fund it. Now, let's look at a policy like opportunity scholarships. This is a piece of legislation we have here in Connecticut that's being proposed to allow people to get a tax credit for making donations to organizations that fund K-12 scholarships, and families can choose to go to any school that they want to go to. That is going to move us way up on the social liberty side of things. You have many more choices when you can pay for the schooling yourself. There's also more economic liberty because instead of using your tax dollars and redistributing them as they see fit, it is a tax credit scheme, so people have more choice into where they are putting their dollars. You can do this with any policy or political ideology or even a politician. It's a lot of fun to do with your kids, and it really helps keep your conversations with friends constructive. You can download my version of the Liberty Scale for free using the link in the description down below. I recommend hanging it on your fridge or keeping it nearby wherever people congregate and have conversations that inevitably get political. You can pull it out and avoid getting lost in the ever-changing ground of the left-right politics and the polarization that comes with it, and instead ground yourself in a constructive conversation focused on the proper role of government. Just remember, when you're caught in the trap of left-right politics, you're implicitly accepting the idea that either side has the right to use the power of the government to enforce their preferred policy program upon you. Of course, it's for your own good, so don't worry, no big deal, right? But by reframing the conversation to be about the proper role of the government's power, we get off the treadmill of two-party politics and we can actually take the time to understand and assess our own political perspectives, as well as those of others, within a more stable yet dynamic framework. To learn more about the history of party politics and how to remedy the left-right divide that we have here today in the United States, watch this video next.
Come on.